My name is Nora. I sat perfectly still in the sterile silence of Mr. Davies' office, the chill from the air conditioning, doing little to stir the storm brewing within me. My hands, clasped loosely in my lap, betrayed none of my calculated anticipation. I had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Then Mark walked in. He carried himself with that familiar, infuriating swagger, a dismissive smirk already curving his lips as his eyes flicked over me. He thought he had me cornered, victory already assured. Our lawyers exchanged polite yet frigid greetings. Mark's attorney, Mr. Harrison, gave me a pitying glance that only fueled my resolve. He knew nothing of the game I was playing. Mr. Davies, my own lawyer, cleared his throat. Mr. Thorne, he began, his voice calm, we have some additional paperwork for you today. Mark's smirk tightened. More formalities? He expected a quick, painless victory and for me to crumble. But what Mr. Davies pushed across the polished mahogany wasn't a supplemental clause or an addendum. It was a thick-bound document, its cover plain and unassuming. Mark snatched it, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. He glanced at the title, then his gaze dropped to the first few lines. The smirk instantly vanished. His eyes, usually glinting with smug self-assurance, widened. A low, strangled sound escaped his throat. I watched him, my own gaze unwavering, sharp as ice. His face, so often flushed with a sense of entitlement, began to drain of color. It was a slow, sickening process, like watching a vibrant painting bleach under a harsh light. His jaw hung slightly open, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, stark terror I had never seen. The arrogance was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated fear. His face was utterly devoid of color, pale as a ghost, as if all his blood had been siphoned away. And in that precise moment, I knew. My revenge had just begun. But to understand why, we need to go back. Back to the day I still believed in him. I remember the first time I met Mark Thorne. It was at a friend's rooftop party in Lincoln Park, the city lights a dazzling backdrop to a perfect summer night. He had this easy smile, a magnetism that pulled you in. We talked for hours, oblivious to the music and the crowd around us. He was ambitious, witty, and seemed to genuinely see me for who I was. I felt a connection I'd never experienced before. I believed we were destined for something extraordinary. Our early years were a whirlwind of shared dreams and fierce ambition. Mark was passionate about his tech startup, a brilliant idea he believed would revolutionize the financial sector. I had a promising career in marketing then, a role I enjoyed and excelled at. But he needed support, he said. Someone to manage the chaos, be his rock, and handle both finances and the household while he poured every ounce of his energy into building our future. I saw it as a partnership, an investment in us. I left my job not without a pang of regret to become his silent partner, his unwavering support system. I managed our joint accounts, balanced the books for his nascent company, and handled myriad administrative tasks, freeing him to innovate. The subtle shifts began almost imperceptibly. At first, it was just late nights, then entire weekends spent at the office. Our conversations grew shorter, less intimate, always circling back to his work, his mounting successes, which he'd praise with increasing frequency, highlighting his brilliance and foresight. In the same breath, he'd subtly diminish my contributions. He started managing our finances with an iron fist, questioning every expense, despite my meticulous tracking. My dreams, the small creative projects I once pursued, withered under his growing control and disinterest. The promises became hollow. "We'll take that trip once the company takes off," he'd say, but the trip never materialized. "We'll talk about your ideas soon," but soon never came. Financial decisions, once a shared discussion, became his unilateral pronouncements. I remember the shock when he invested a significant portion of our savings into a high-risk venture, without even a discussion. "I know what I'm doing," he had said, his voice laced with an impatience I hadn't heard before. And I did. I desperately wanted to. Our lives were intertwined, financially and emotionally. We had a joint bank account, a shared investment portfolio, and the company, his company, he increasingly called it, that I had poured years of my life into. I wasn't just his wife, I was a co-creator, a silent architect of his success. Every late night I spent poring over spreadsheets. Every sacrifice I made was for what I believed was our future, our empire. I thought we were building something together, brick by brick, a solid foundation for the rest of our lives. But I should have seen it from the beginning, the cracks forming silently beneath the surface. I was so caught up in the romance, so deeply in love, that I chose to ignore the warning signs. I blinded myself to the creeping control, the dismissive words, the broken promises. And that choice, my choice to love him blindly, would eventually cost me everything. The day Mark told me he wanted a divorce wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing bleed. We were sitting in our impeccably furnished living room, the one I had decorated with such care, filled with the minimalist aesthetic he admired. His words were delivered with a surgical precision that cut deeper than any shout. "Nora," he began, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, "this isn't working." He didn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed on some distant point, as if reading from an invisible script. He blamed me for everything. Every single problem in our marriage, according to Mark, was my fault. I felt a cold dread spread through me, chilling me to the bone. This wasn't the Mark I married. This was a stranger, weaponizing every shared vulnerability, every quiet complaint I'd ever voiced. He was systematically dismantling me, piece by piece, with chilling efficiency. Then came the final blow, delivered with a casual cruelty that stole my breath. "And for the record," he said, finally turning to face me, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips, "you're not getting anything." He explained it all away. The prenuptial agreement, he said, protected him. I barely remembered signing it, a hasty affair before the wedding, overshadowed by the whirlwind of love and future promises. Or maybe, I now realize, it was meticulously concealed within a stack of other documents designed for me to overlook. The shock hit me first, a dizzying wave that made the room spin. I tried to argue, to demand answers, but my voice caught in my throat. This couldn't be happening. We had built a life together. Our joint accounts, the company I helped establish, the apartment we shared. Surely I had rights. I had contributed. I had given up everything for him. Doubt gnawed at me, then a cold, crushing despair. Mark simply stood there, watching me crumble, his face impassive. It was as if he was observing a scientific experiment, detached and indifferent. He had planned this, I realized. Every cold word, every calculated move. The reality of his words hit me with brutal force in the days that followed. I tried to access our joint bank account. Empty. My credit cards, the ones I rarely used, were maxed out. I checked the company accounts, those I once managed meticulously. My access had been revoked. Every financial lifeline I thought I had was severed, leaving me stranded in a desert of debt. I was trapped in our beautiful modern Chicago apartment, the one with the huge glass windows overlooking the city. It felt like a gilded cage. I couldn't afford the rent, the utilities, not even basic groceries. I had no income, no savings, no assets under my name. Mark had ensured I had nothing. He had systematically erased my financial existence. Desperate, I called a lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a name pulled from a quick online search, a more affordable option given my sudden destitution. The consultation was brief and brutally disappointing. He listened, shaking his head slowly, his expression grim. "Nora," he said, his voice laced with pity, "it appears Mark has covered every angle. The prenup is ironclad. Most assets were transferred or never in your name to begin with." His words confirmed my bleak reality. I was truly, utterly alone, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a mountain of debt. Every door slammed shut in my face. Every phone call I made led to a dead end. He hadn't just abandoned me, he had systematically erased me. And as I stared at the eviction notice, I realized I was truly, utterly alone, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a crushing debt. The eviction notice was just the beginning. The apartment, once my sanctuary, became a memory. I had to leave, carrying what few belongings I could salvage in a single worn suitcase. The city that once felt like home now loomed large, indifferent to my plight. Survival became my only mode. I scoured online job boards, walked into every coffee shop and diner, begging for work. My once polished resume was useless. I took whatever I could get, bussing tables in a greasy spoon, where the smell of stale fries clung to my clothes, cleaning offices late at night when the city was asleep, even dog walking for a few dollars. Each dollar was a battle won. I started selling my things. First, the small trinkets, then my favorite books, eventually even some of the jewelry Mark had given me in happier times. Each item felt like a piece of myself chipping away. I ate sparingly, often skipping meals entirely, the gnawing hunger a constant companion. My body thinned, my clothes hung loose, and the vibrant glow I once possessed faded into a dull pallor. Sleep became a luxury, a fleeting escape I rarely found. My mind raced with anxieties, replaying every mistake, every broken promise. I'd lie awake in cheap motel rooms, the hum of the city outside a stark contrast to the silence of my despair. The stress etched lines around my eyes, and my once bright blue gaze grew hollow, distant. I felt invisible, a ghost haunting the streets of my former life. I avoided familiar places, terrified of running into anyone who knew the old Nora. The isolation was absolute. His words, Mark's cruel words, echoed in my head like a tormenting symphony. "You're not in the trenches every day," he'd sneer, dismissing my insights. Each time I scrubbed a dirty floor or wiped down a sticky counter, I heard his voice. "You're not getting anything." It was a constant reminder of how thoroughly he had engineered my downfall. And I had. I had trusted him with everything. One afternoon, during a break from my cleaning job, I stopped by a cafe, hoping to warm my hands with a cheap coffee. I was tired, disheveled, my jacket stained from cleaning products. As I waited in line, I saw him. Mark. He was laughing, his arm around a stunning woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a designer dress. She radiated confidence, a stark contrast to my own weary existence. They looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine, carefree and prosperous. He didn't see me. He wouldn't have recognized me, perhaps. I was just another anonymous face in the crowd, a shadow. I quickly ducked out, my heart pounding, a fresh wave of humiliation washing over me. He was moving on, thriving, while I was fighting for every crumb, stripped bare of everything we had built. It was a brutal mirror reflecting my new reality. Was this my life now? A series of endless struggles, of invisible toil, of constant hunger and gnawing fear. Was there truly no escape from this abyss? Every path I considered seemed to lead to another dead end, another slammed door. The world was a cold, unforgiving place, and I was utterly alone in it. I stood by the window, looking out at the glittering lights of the city, a city where I once had a place, a future. Now it felt like a mocking reminder of everything I had lost. There was only one thought in my head: is this the end? Is this all there is for me? But then something flickered, a cold ember of defiance. Maybe not. Maybe there was another way. The flickering ember of defiance within me was small, almost invisible, but it was there. It was the whisper of a question: what if? What if this wasn't all there was for Nora? What if I wasn't meant to simply fade into obscurity? I had managed to find a tiny, shabby studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. A place far removed from the glittering skyline I once called home. The air still smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. My few remaining boxes sat piled in a corner, mocking me with their sparse contents. I had been putting off unpacking them, each item a relic of a life I no longer lived. One dreary afternoon, pushing back against the encroaching despair, I forced myself to confront the boxes. Most contained old books, a few faded photographs, the kind of sentimental clutter you accumulate over years. As I sifted through a box labeled Old Office, a collection of forgotten pens and notebooks, my fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. It was a USB drive, small and unremarkable, tucked beneath a stack of old business cards. I didn't recognize it at first. It certainly wasn't mine. Then a faint memory surfaced. Mark had a collection of these drives, always encrypting them, always secretive about their contents. He used to joke, "My life's work is on these, Nora." I had always dismissed it, another one of his grandiose statements. I almost tossed it into the trash, assuming it was just old, useless work files. But something stopped me. A library computer, cheap and slow, became my makeshift investigation hub. My hands trembled slightly as I inserted the drive, half expecting it to be empty or corrupted. A password prompt appeared. My heart pounded. I tried the obvious ones: Mark's birthday, our anniversary, names of old pets. Nothing. Frustration mounted, threatening to drown that tiny flicker of defiance. Then, on a whim, I typed in the name of his first company, the one he had started fresh out of college, the one he rarely spoke about. Access granted. A list of folders appeared, mostly mundane. I clicked through them, finding nothing out of the ordinary, just standard business documents. My shoulders slumped. Just as I was about to give up, a tiny icon at the bottom right corner of the screen caught my eye. A hidden folder, cleverly disguised, almost invisible against this desktop background. My fingers froze over the mouse. This felt different. This felt dangerous. I clicked it open. Inside, it wasn't a collection of work files. It was a labyrinth of spreadsheets, scanned documents, and encrypted messages. My breath hitched in my throat as I started to piece together the puzzle. Offshore accounts I'd never heard of. Shell corporations registered in distant lands. Invoices that were clearly inflated, showing money diverted to personal accounts. Not just any accounts, but those tied to the offshore entities. It was all there. A meticulous, systematic scheme of tax evasion. Funds siphoned off from client payments, laundered through fake companies, all while Mark presented himself as a legitimate, highly successful businessman. He wasn't just hiding assets from me, he was hiding them from everyone. From his partners, his investors, the government. The lavish lifestyle he so carefully curated, the one he claimed was built on his genius, was in fact built on fraud and deception. A cold, sickening wave washed over me. This wasn't just a husband abandoning his wife. This was a criminal protecting his empire, and I was collateral damage. The weight of his betrayal, which I had thought I fully understood, deepened into something far more monstrous. He had not only left me with nothing, he had intentionally stripped me bare to minimize any potential exposure for his own illicit dealings. My first thought was sheer terror. Exposing him would be like throwing a rock at a hornet's nest. He was powerful, vindictive. But then a different emotion took hold. A cold, hard fury unlike anything I had ever felt. The years of emotional manipulation, the financial ruin, the public humiliation, it all condensed into a potent cocktail of righteous anger. He had played me for a fool, cast me aside as if I were worthless. But I was holding the evidence that could shatter his world. My eyes, once filled with despair, hardened into a glacial blue, reflecting a resolve I didn't know I possessed. The desperate, cowering Nora was gone. In her place was a woman who had nothing left to lose, and everything to fight for. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a powerful mixture of shock and pure, unadulterated rage. He hadn't just left me with nothing. He had built his empire on a house of cards, built on lies and deceit. And I was holding the match. The question was, did I dare strike it? My fingers trembled that day, not from fear alone, but from the raw, volcanic surge of fury that had finally erupted within me. The question of whether I dared to strike the match no longer lingered. I would not just strike it, I would ignite an inferno. The desperate, cowering Nora had been irrevocably replaced. In her stead stood a woman with nothing left to lose, whose very essence had been forged in the crucible of Mark's betrayal. My gaze, once reflecting despair, now held a glacial blue, sharp and unyielding. I returned to the library every day, sometimes for hours, sometimes until closing. The cheap computer became my arsenal. I connected the USB drive, copying every file, every encrypted document, every hidden spreadsheet. My small studio apartment, once a symbol of my defeat, transformed into my war room. The sparse living room became a chaotic tapestry of printouts. I taped screenshots of inflated invoices to the wall, side by side with bank statements. I cross-referenced dates, matching suspicious transactions to the offshore accounts. Nora, the woman who once planned elegant dinner parties, was now an amateur forensic accountant, meticulously tracing a complex web of deceit. Every email that referenced special projects or undisclosed investments was printed and highlighted. Every discrepancy, no matter how small, was noted. I spent sleepless nights poring over legal jargon online, teaching myself the intricacies of corporate fraud and tax evasion. I researched shell corporations, the legal loopholes Mark might have exploited, and the penalties for such crimes. I learned how the very system designed to prevent injustice could also be twisted to facilitate it. The scale of his operations, the sheer audacity of his crimes, was breathtaking. He wasn't just a dishonest man. He was a criminal mastermind, and I had been living blind beside him. Doubt, a serpent in my mind, would occasionally coil around my resolve. What if I failed? What if he was too powerful, too well connected? What if his retaliation would be even more brutal than his initial abandonment? The fear was a cold, sharp blade pressing against my throat. But then the images would flash before my eyes, my empty bank account, the eviction notice, his sneering face telling me I was worthless, his arm around that blonde woman, living a life of luxury built on my ruin. That memory, that profound feeling of being discarded with nothing, reignited my furnace of defiance. It was a fuel stronger than any fear. My goal crystallized with chilling clarity. This was no longer just about a fair divorce settlement, about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. This was about justice. I wanted to expose him, to strip away the veneer of respectability he so carefully maintained. I wanted to shatter his carefully constructed reputation, and I wanted to ensure he faced the full, unyielding force of the law. He had taken everything from Nora, but he hadn't anticipated that he would leave me with an unquenchable thirst for retribution. One evening, exhausted but wired, I stumbled upon a truly critical piece of information. A seemingly innocuous file, labeled Old Budget, was actually a meticulously coded ledger. It was a reference to his mother's maiden name, a detail he sometimes mentioned in passing when he was sentimental. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing the name. The file unlocked. Inside, I found direct, irrefutable evidence, a detailed breakdown of how he funneled specific client funds into his personal offshore accounts, complete with dates, amounts, and the names of the fictitious companies he used. It was the definitive proof I needed, a smoking gun. Each piece of evidence I uncovered, each meticulously cross-referenced document, was like another brick. I was building a wall, a towering, impenetrable structure, carefully placed brick by brick, surrounding him from all sides. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed an architect, someone who knew how to use these intricate blueprints to bring his entire empire crashing down. But who could I possibly trust with such a dangerous task? My fingers trembled that day, not from fear alone, but from the raw, volcanic surge of fury that had finally erupted within me. The question of whether I dared to strike the match no longer lingered. I would not just strike it, I would ignite an inferno. The desperate, cowering Nora had been irrevocably replaced. In her stead stood a woman with nothing left to lose, whose very essence had been forged in the crucible of Mark's betrayal. My gaze, once reflecting despair, now held a glacial blue, sharp and unyielding. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed an architect, someone who knew how to use these intricate blueprints to bring his entire empire crashing down. But who could I possibly trust with such a dangerous task? The dusty legal aid office I'd initially considered now seemed utterly inadequate. Mark wouldn't just hire a bulldog, he'd hire a pack of wolves. I needed an alpha. I scoured online forums and discreetly asked for recommendations among my few remaining contacts. I was looking for names whispered with both dread and respect in the high-stakes legal world. My last savings, a meager sum I'd hoarded for emergencies, would barely cover a single consultation. But this was the ultimate emergency. I booked an appointment with a firm known for handling complex corporate disputes and high-net-worth divorces. Their reputation was legendary, their fees astronomical. The office of Mr. Davies was understated, yet it exuded an aura of quiet power. Lawyer Davies, a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm front, sat across from me. His eyes, the color of gunmetal, held a dismissive glint at first. I ignored the sting, simply opening my carefully organized binder. Page by page, I laid out Mark's offshore accounts, the inflated invoices, the meticulously coded ledger. I explained the pattern, the timing, the sheer audacity of his scheme. The dismissiveness in his eyes slowly, imperceptibly, shifted to a flicker of interest, then to a focused intensity. Nora, I knew, was no longer just a client. I was a potential weapon. He leaned back, a long, assessing silence filling the room. "Nora," he finally said, his voice deep, "this isn't just a divorce case. This is a corporate fraud exposé." He outlined a plan that dwarfed my initial hopes. It wasn't about a settlement anymore. It was about tearing down Mark's entire edifice of lies. He spoke of forensic accountants, private investigators, a team I never imagined I could afford. The next few weeks were a blur of intense meetings. Lawyer Davies brought in a former IRS investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Brenda, and a financial analyst who specialized in offshore shell corporations. My small apartment transformed from a war room into a strategic command center. We spent hours dissecting every transaction, mapping out Mark's labyrinthine network of deceit. It was no longer just Nora versus Mark. It was Nora and a formidable legal team versus his empire. Lawyer Davies then began to sculpt me, not into a victim, but into a witness. He drilled me on every detail, every date, every account number. "They will try to break you, Nora," he warned, his gaze unwavering. "They will question your sanity, your motives." He taught me to articulate my story with precision, to control my emotions, to project an air of calm resolve, even when my insides churned with fear. I practiced my testimony, recounting the evidence, rehearsing the cold, hard facts until they flowed effortlessly from my lips. My resolve hardened further with each session. I was ready. Lawyer Davies looked at me, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Nora," he said, "we have them. Every piece is in place." My heart pounded, a mix of fear and exhilarating anticipation. "More than ready," I whispered. The day of the meeting had been set. The day of the meeting had arrived. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of fear and exhilaration. I sat across the polished mahogany table, the same table where I had once signed my initial ill-fated divorce papers. Lawyer Davies was beside me, a silent, formidable anchor. I wore my black blazer, my posture rigid, every fiber of Nora's being radiating an icy calm that belied the inferno raging within. The door opened, and Mark strode in. He was a portrait of arrogant confidence, a smug smirk plastered across his face. He was flanked by his lawyer, a man I recognized as a junior partner, clearly less informed about the true nature of the impending battle. Mark's gaze flicked over me, dismissive, as if I were a mere inconvenience. He expected a quick, easy settlement, a final dismissal of the woman he had so carelessly discarded. "Good morning, everyone," Mark's lawyer offered, his voice a practiced cordiality that grated on my ears. Superficial pleasantries were exchanged, a thin veneer over the simmering tension. I offered no smile, no acknowledgement beyond a cold, steady stare. My focus was absolute. Then Lawyer Davies began. His voice was calm, measured, yet it carried an undeniable weight. He didn't start with alimony. He didn't start with marital assets. He started with a precise, chilling recitation of corporate malfeasance. "Mr." Mark's smirk faltered. He let out a scoff, a derisive laugh. "Baseless accusations," he sneered, his gaze flashing to me, attempting to project his old intimidation. "Nora, have you truly sunk so low?" His voice dripped with condescension, a familiar tone that had once chipped away at my self-worth. It no longer had any effect. Lawyer Davies, unmoved, merely pushed a thick binder across the table. "I assure you, mister." He began to lay out the evidence, piece by painstaking piece. Dates, specific account numbers, names of shell corporations, copies of bank statements showing the fraudulent transfers. He presented emails, coded ledgers, the very document I had unlocked with his mother's maiden name. Brenda's meticulous forensic analysis, confirming every detail, every illicit transaction, every penny siphoned. The color drained from Mark's face, leaving him a ghastly ashen white. His eyes, usually so arrogant, now darted wildly, like a trapped animal's. His junior lawyer, initially oblivious, flipped through the documents, his face a mask of dawning horror. He shot Mark a look of stunned anger, a silent accusation. Mark, the smooth, untouchable mastermind, was unraveling before my very eyes. Our eyes met across the polished table. His were wide with fear, reflecting a dawning terror. Mine, I hoped, shone with the glacial blue of a reckoning, a silent, triumphant fire. No words passed between us. None were needed. The message was clear. I had seen him, truly seen him, and I had built a case against him that he could not escape. Mark's lawyer quickly scrambled to control the rapidly escalating disaster. He cleared his throat, a forced calmness in his voice, his eyes already calculating damage control. "Well, mister." The game had truly, irrevocably changed. What followed was not a negotiation, but a surrender. Mark, cornered and exposed, fought like a wounded animal for a short while, but Lawyer Davies systematically dismantled every desperate argument. He laid bare the full extent of the charges Nora was prepared to press, charges that would not only destroy his business, but also land him in a federal prison for years. The sheer weight of the evidence was crushing. Within hours, a new settlement agreement was drafted. It was a complete reversal of his original insulting offer. My husband, Mark, now agreed to transfer a significant portion of his company shares to me. Not just a token amount, but enough to ensure my financial independence for life. He would pay substantial alimony, covering not only my immediate needs, but also compensating for years of unpaid labor and emotional distress. Crucially, he had to sign over ownership of the modern Chicago apartment, the very place I had meticulously curated, and several other significant assets, all in exchange for my agreement not to pursue criminal charges. For now. It was a Faustian bargain for him, a bitter pill he was forced to swallow to preserve what little freedom he had left. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the pen. This was it. The culmination of months of fear, painstaking investigation, and a quiet, burning rage. But as I looked at the neatly typed pages, the anger wasn't there anymore. It had been replaced by a profound sense of vindication, a quiet triumph. My internal storm, which had churned relentlessly for so long, finally began to subside. I saw Mark across the table, his face still pale, his eyes hollow. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a defeated emptiness. He watched me, unable to look away, as I signed my name, Nora, with a steady, decisive stroke. It wasn't revenge I felt, not anymore. It was freedom. The divorce was finalized swiftly, a mere formality after that harrowing meeting. The ripples of Mark's downfall spread quickly through the business world. Though I hadn't pressed criminal charges, the settlement itself was a public acknowledgement of his wrongdoing. Whispers turned into rumors, then into full-blown investigations. I heard through the grapevine that his company was being scrutinized by regulatory bodies, its once stellar reputation tarnished beyond repair. His new relationship with the woman he had so brazenly flaunted inevitably crumbled. Who would want to be associated with a man whose empire was built on a house of cards? Mark lost everything he had constructed with his lies, his business, his prestige, and his carefully curated image. He was left with nothing but the hollow echo of his own deceit. For Nora, life began anew. With the settlement, I was not just financially secure. I was empowered. I invested wisely, taking the time to learn and grow my resources. I finally had the freedom to pursue a long dormant passion, photography. I enrolled in classes, traveled to breathtaking landscapes, and began to see the world through a new lens, capturing its beauty and complexity. I started a small online business selling my prints, a venture born not of necessity but of pure joy. My Chicago apartment, once a cage of quiet despair, became my sanctuary, a space of creation and peace. I was no longer defined by Mark or by his betrayal. I was Nora, independent, creative, and emotionally free. Looking back, I realized that my journey hadn't been about revenge, not truly. It was about justice, about reclaiming what was rightfully mine, and about ensuring Mark faced the consequences of his actions. It was about proving to myself and to the world that I would not be broken, that my worth was not determined by someone else's treachery. I learned that true strength doesn't come from external validation or from someone else's approval. It comes from within, from finding your voice, standing up for yourself, and knowing your own immutable worth. My name is Nora, and I am the architect of my own destiny. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever felt trapped or underestimated, remember that you have the power to write your own ending. Share your thoughts in the comments below, hit that like button, and subscribe to join our community. Your strength is your story.